Few people stop to reflect on the death of Joseph of Egypt, and even fewer know that his mummified body remained stored for centuries in an Egyptian sarcophagus, never having been buried in the land he so deeply longed for. But why? Why would a man who rose to the highest level of Egyptian power, practically revered as a prince, make such a specific request about his bones? The truth is that Joseph, even while being honored as one of Egypt's greatest authorities, never forgot his origin, his identity, or the covenant God had made with the patriarchs. And in this video, we're going to uncover how Joseph's death is described in the biblical account, what his mummification meant, and why it's so symbolic, the reason why his bones waited centuries to be taken to the promised land, and how all of this points to something much greater, God's faithfulness to his promises. Joseph is one of the most impactful figures in the book of Genesis, and his story plays a key role in the narrative of the patriarchs. He was the second to last son of Jacob, and the first with Rachel, the wife Jacob loved the most. From a young age, Joseph stirred envy among his brothers, not only for being their father's favorite, but also for the mysterious dreams he would share so naturally, dreams that suggested he would one day be honored by the entire family. That mix of favoritism and prophetic visions created a tense atmosphere at home. Jacob, for example, gave Joseph a coat of many colors, a symbol of distinction, which only deepened his brother's resentment. Driven by jealousy and anger, they decided to get rid of him. At first, they planned to kill him, but eventually sold him as a slave to a group of Ishmaelite merchants passing by on their way to Egypt. Once in Egypt, Joseph was bought by Potiphar, an important officer of Pharaoh. In Potiphar's house, Joseph gained trust and responsibility, but was the victim of a false accusation from his master's wife. She tried to seduce him, and when rejected, accused him falsely. As a result, Joseph was imprisoned. Even in prison, Joseph kept his faith in God and continued to stand out for his character and wisdom. There, he interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker, and his interpretations came true exactly as he had said. Sometime later, Pharaoh himself had puzzling dreams, and the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Called before the king, Joseph explained that the dreams foretold 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Impressed by his wisdom and discernment, Pharaoh appointed Joseph governor of Egypt, the second most powerful man in the kingdom, in charge of overseeing the entire system of harvest and food storage. When famine struck various lands, including Canaan, Joseph's brothers traveled to Egypt in search of food, unaware they would have to negotiate with the very brother they had sold years earlier. That reunion was filled with emotion, repentance, and reconciliation. When Joseph saw that his brothers were transformed and remorseful, he revealed his identity with tears and embraces, saying that everything that had happened was allowed by God to save many lives. After that, Jacob and his entire family moved to Egypt, settling in the region of Goshen, a fertile area ideal for herding. There, Joseph continued to care for his family with generosity. When his father grew old and felt his death approaching, he asked Joseph to promise to bury his body in Canaan alongside their ancestors. Joseph faithfully fulfilled that wish, bringing his father's body back to the promised land with all the honor and respect he deserved. After Jacob's death, the book of Genesis highlights Joseph's relationship with his brothers, especially how he dealt with the painful past they shared. Though they had already reconciled, the brothers still feared that with their father gone, Joseph would seek revenge for the harm they had caused. However, Joseph once again demonstrated the noble character that defined his life. He chose to forgive, showing compassion and reaffirming a deep spiritual vision. Everything that happened was part of a greater plan of God, who even used suffering to preserve lives. Instead of holding a grudge, Joseph offered comfort. He told his brothers that what they intended for evil, God turned into good, a powerful truth that still inspires many Bible readers today. This statement, recorded in Genesis 50:20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good," is one of the most striking verses of the chapter, as it expresses Joseph's unshakable faith in God's sovereignty, even in the face of the worst experiences. In his old age, Joseph remained in Egypt, surrounded by his large family. The Bible records that he lived long enough to see not only his children and grandchildren, but also his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, a sign of blessing and prosperity in his old age. Joseph's longevity is highlighted. He lived to be 110 years old, a symbolic age in ancient Egyptian culture, representing a full life filled with honor, wisdom, and achievement. According to historical studies, this was considered the perfect age in Egyptian tradition. In his final days, Joseph made sure to reaffirm God's covenant with the people of Israel. In a moment full of faith and hope, he prophesied that one day God would visit the descendants of Jacob and bring them out of Egypt, leading them back to the promised land, the very land that had been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. With this declaration, he showed that although he had attained a high position in a foreign land, his heart remained connected to the divine promises. Before he died, Joseph also made a very specific request, that when God fulfilled his promise and delivered the people from Egypt, his bones would be taken with them to be buried in the land of his ancestors. This demonstrated his living faith, even in the face of death. The book of Genesis ends with this solemn and deeply meaningful note. Joseph died at the age of 110, was embalmed according to Egyptian customs, and placed in a coffin in Egypt, awaiting the day when his remains would be brought back to the promised land as a sign of the faithful fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph showed great faith and commitment to God's promises by insistently asking his brothers to swear they would carry his bones back to the promised land when the time came for the Lord to deliver Israel from Egypt. This request was not just a personal wish, but a profound expression of hope in the faithfulness of God and in the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph was embalmed and placed in a sarcophagus in Egypt, a gesture that reveals both his importance in Egyptian society and the respect he was given. At that time, such treatment was reserved for individuals of high prestige, such as nobles, priests, and members of royalty. Embalming was a highly developed practice in ancient Egypt, involving sophisticated procedures to preserve the body, with the intention of preparing it for life after death, according to their religious beliefs. The way Joseph was treated after his death shows how much he had come to be respected in that foreign land. As Egypt's administrator, virtually the most powerful man after Pharaoh, Joseph received honors worthy of a prince. He was not only mummified, but also placed in a sarcophagus, something typical for Egyptian leaders and rulers. Archaeology and historical documents confirm that mummification was seen as a refined art full of spiritual symbolism. By receiving this kind of burial, Joseph was, in a way, integrated into the cultural world of Egypt, even though he never abandoned his identity as a descendant of Israel. This fusion between Hebrew faith and Egyptian traditions is one of the richest and most fascinating aspects of his story. Another significant detail is that the Bible highlights Joseph's age at death, 110 years. In Egyptian culture of that time, this number held symbolic weight. It was considered the maximum point of human existence, the ideal of a long, blessed, and successful life. Though the number was not always taken literally, it represented a complete life cycle and was often associated with wise individuals favored by the gods. Therefore, by stating that Joseph lived to be 110, the biblical text seems to engage directly with Egyptian thought, showing that he was not only recognized as an important foreigner, but as someone who achieved the highest standard of life according to that people's values. The Bible does not report any illness or suffering that caused Joseph's death, leading us to believe that he died of natural causes in peace after a long life marked by faith, forgiveness, and great achievements. After his death, the Israelites remained in Egypt, For a time, they lived in harmony with the Egyptians, enjoying fertile lands and a stable life, especially in the region of Goshen, where Joseph's family had settled. Some scholars suggest that Joseph lived during the rule of the Hyksos, a Semitic people who governed part of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, around the 17th century BC. This would explain, according to that theory, the openness of the Egyptians to receive and elevate a Hebrew to such a high position. However, the biblical text does not mention the name of any pharaoh from that era, leaving room for different interpretations. What we do know for certain, as later revealed in the book of Exodus, is that over time a new pharaoh arose, someone who did not know Joseph nor the benefits he had brought to Egypt. This new scenario marked the beginning of a dark period in the history of Israel, paving the way for slavery, and later, the deliverance led by Moses. With the rise of a new dynasty in Egypt, a radical change began in how the Israelites were treated. The memory of Joseph's deeds, who had once saved Egypt from famine and brought prosperity to the nation, seemed to have been completely erased from the Egyptian throne's memory. The book of Exodus states that a new pharaoh arose, a king who did not know Joseph. This expression refers not just to a lack of information, but to the breaking of a silent alliance that had previously ensured acceptance and respect for the people of Israel. This new pharaoh, realizing that the Israelites were multiplying rapidly, felt threatened. Fearing that this foreign people, though living in Egypt, might become too strong and ally with enemies, he decided to act harshly. Thus began a period of severe oppression. The Israelites were forced to work as slaves on major construction projects, subjected to heavy burdens and cruel treatment. This turning point marked the beginning of a collective suffering that would last for generations. This new political and social landscape set the stage for the future deliverance of the Hebrew people. It was in this context that Moses, the deliverer chosen by God, would rise and the great event known as the Exodus would unfold, one of the most emblematic stories in Scripture. But it is interesting to note that even before all of this happened, Joseph was already concerned about the future of his family. Despite being honored in Egypt as a prominent figure, practically a prince, Joseph never allowed his heart to disconnect from the promises God had made to his ancestors. He knew that Egypt was only a temporary place, not Israel's final destination. That's why, before he died, he made a very specific request, that when the time came for God to deliver his people, his bones be taken with them, to be buried in the promised land. This detail may seem small, but it carries profound meaning. Joseph didn't want his mortal remains to stay in a foreign land, even though that land had been the stage of his glory. What he desired was to rest in the land of the covenant, the same land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This shows that his identity was firmly rooted in faith and in the promises of God, not in the titles and honors he received in Egypt. Centuries later, as recorded in the book of Exodus, the Israelites did fulfill that promise. When Moses led the people out of Egypt, Joseph's bones were carried with them, symbolizing that the faith of that patriarch had transcended generations. This gesture became so significant that the author of Hebrews, in chapter 11, known as the Hall of Faith, mentions Joseph as an example of someone who, even at the end of his life, trusted in the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph's life and death teach us that even when circumstances change, God continues to guide history perfectly. Joseph saw beyond the present. He understood that behind the events, even the most painful ones, like the betrayal of his brothers or his years in prison, there was a greater purpose unfolding. His attitude toward death was one of trust and hope. He not only forgave his brothers, but affirmed that everything they had experienced worked together for the preservation of the lineage chosen by God. He declared with conviction that the Lord would surely visit his people and bring them back to the promised land. That confidence revealed a heart firmly anchored in eternal promises, not in temporary circumstances. So, although the book of Genesis ends with Joseph's death, the story of God's people does not end there. On the contrary, it is the beginning of a new chapter, marked by the expectation of divine promises being fulfilled. Joseph reminds us that God's faithfulness spans generations, and those who trust in him are never forgotten. Back in Genesis 15, God had revealed to Abraham that his descendants would spend a long time as foreigners in a land that was not theirs, where they would be oppressed, but that at the right time they would come out free and enriched. That is the context in which we must understand Joseph's death, as part of a much larger story that was still unfolding. Joseph's instruction regarding his bones may seem like just a small detail at first glance, but it carries deep meaning. By asking that his remains be returned to the promised land when God delivered his people from Egypt, Joseph was reaffirming a living hope. He not only believed in the promises made to his forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he also prophesied the future of the nation of Israel. His words anticipated the mission of Moses, the Exodus, and the birth of Israel as a free and established people. Theologically, Joseph's death is more than the end of a biblical character. It represents the continuity of God's covenant and his constant care for his people, even amidst changing scenarios, from the fields to the palace, from Egypt to the wilderness, and eventually to Canaan. God's faithfulness spans generations and overcomes every human obstacle. Joseph left a remarkable legacy. He lived with wisdom, governed with justice, and forgave from the heart. Despite all the honors he received in Egypt, he never lost sight of who he truly was, a child of the promise. The faith that sustained him during rejection, imprisonment, and exile also accompanied him to his final days. And before he died, he made it clear, God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land. That phrase, recorded in Genesis 50:24, is filled with hope and trust, like a flame that would burn for centuries in the hearts of the Hebrews. The Bible tells us that Joseph lived to be 110 years old, an age considered ideal by the Egyptians of his time, symbolizing a full and blessed life. But more than longevity, what marked his life was faithfulness. He was a bridge between the generation of the patriarchs and the emergence of the nation of Israel. He ruled with wisdom, but always kept his eyes on the fulfillment of eternal promises. Even after his death, Joseph remained a symbol of faith. In Joshua 24:32, we read that many years later, his bones were finally buried in Shechem, in the Promised Land, exactly as he had requested. That final act was the seal of a life that consistently pointed to the God who fulfills every promise. Therefore, Joseph's death does not represent the end of a story, but a milestone full of meaning within the biblical narrative. He was a living witness of God's faithfulness from the pit to the palace. And even in his farewell, he pointed toward the future of redemption. His story echoes in the New Testament, where the Exodus is seen as a symbol of the greatest liberation of all, salvation through Jesus Christ. Just as God visited the Hebrew people in Egypt to set them free, he also visited humanity by sending his Son. Joseph, though he did not see the complete fulfillment of the promise, rested believing that God would finish his work. He was not deceived by the fleeting glory of Egypt, because his true identity was in the hands of the God who turns pain into blessing, exile into purpose, and death into living hope. Now I want to know, did you already know the story of Joseph's death? Did this study bring you any new insights about the Bible? If so, leave us a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any content that can strengthen your faith. If this message could bless someone, share this video with that person. In the pinned comment below, I've left 2 special resources lovingly prepared to help you walk more firmly in faith, grow in the knowledge of the Word, and experience God's care on your journey. See you in the next video. May God bless you.